Okay, so we'll kick off. You're very welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. My name is Hannah O'Dwyer. I work for AsIAM as the organisation's training manager and education officer, and I will be your MC this afternoon, this lunchtime. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to tune into our masterclass on reasonable accommodations and in-work supports. This is the fourth masterclass of a series that we will be delivering over the coming months as part of our partnership with IrishJobs.ie. At the launch event of our partnership on the 1st of April, we revealed our collaborative report, Autism in the Workplace, which evidenced that almost 4 in 5 autistic people face barriers to employment in Ireland. While it's currently estimated that at least 1 in 65 people in Ireland are autistic, we are still seeing that 85% of autistic people are unemployed or underemployed. IrishJobs.ie and AsIAM came together to champion autistic talent in the workplace in an effort to address these barriers in practical, strategic ways so that employers can gain the knowledge needed to support autistic and neurodiverse employees. Today, we will be hearing from our own specialists and staff within AsIAM. We'll be hearing from our Deputy CEO, Fiona Ferris, Training and Access Officer Adrian Carroll, and Administrative Assistant Sophia Webb. There will be time at the end of today's masterclass for questions, so please do type any questions that you have into the Q&A box during the webinar. Our first speaker that we'll hear from now is Fiona Ferris. Fiona has worked with AsIAM since 2017, initially in the role of Early Years Specialist, but she assumed the role of Deputy CEO in 2019 and oversees the training department within AsIAM. Fiona delivers talks both nationally and internationally about autism, neurodiversity and disability, while contributing her own experience as an autistic adult and a parent to a child on the spectrum. In her talks, Fiona aims to give practical, relatable knowledge and strategies to assist others in supporting the autistic community to meet their own individual potential and fully participate within their community. Fiona's expertise covers a broad range of issues, including autism and women, neurodiversity, disability rights, employment, accessibility, and education. Outside of work, Fiona is completing an honours degree in law. So I'm very happy to present Fiona to you. Take it away, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and it's lovely to be on the webinar today, actually contributing rather than chairing. So anybody who's been at the masterclasses so far will probably be familiar with many of the AsIAM staff, as we often chair these sessions, but today we wanted to do something a little bit different and actually deliver to you our expertise and our knowledge surrounding the area of reasonable accommodations. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and then I'll give a little bit of background, I suppose, of my own journey and what I think are key points to take away whenever we're talking about reasonable accommodations. So let me just get it up here. Okay, so you should all be able to see that. So often whenever I'm giving talks about employment, I'm talking about the whole process, start to finish, of how you can be an accessible employer, how you can support colleagues in an inclusive work environment. But today we're looking very specifically about the concept of reasonable accommodations and in-work supports. And I think you can have the most inclusive interview process, you can have the most inclusive onboarding process, but unless you're actually looking at the reasonable accommodations that can be put in place for an employee in the workplace, it's not going to be a successful placement for them or a positive experience either. So I've been working, as Hannah mentioned, with AsIAM since 2017. Something that a lot of people don't know is that it wasn't until I actually started working with AsIAM that I was able to manage in full-time employment. Before that, I was never able to cope with a full-time position. And a lot of that is because of the reasonable accommodations that have been put in place for me as an autistic adult in this role, but also the increased understanding that comes with working for an organisation like this about autism, about neurodiversity, and about different levels of need in general. I think in terms of reasonable accommodations, what's important to remember is that the things that will work really well for autistic people will actually just be really beneficial for everybody. So it's not just about autistic or neurodiverse individuals. If you're looking at what accommodations you can put in place to make a role more inclusive, more accessible, more supportive for any employee, you know, that's going to benefit everybody. It's about looking at the process from the very beginning all the way through. So what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of what I felt was the best things that worked for me, but also what we can be looking at across the board in terms of accommodations and in-work supports. I think whenever we talk about reasonable accommodations, we tend to think of the physical accommodations that can be put in place. You know, we think about wheelchair ramps, we think about adjustable desk heights, we think about accessible bathrooms, when in fact for autistic people, they still have the right to reasonable accommodations, but they're not always the things that we can see, they're not always the things that we immediately think of. From my own perspective, I used to find work incredibly difficult, so I often would only be able to work somewhere for a very short period of time before I became overloaded, or I'd only be able to work a certain amount of hours per week because the lack of structure or the lack of clarity in the day-to-day activities left me feeling incredibly anxious or incredibly overwhelmed and unable to actually either continue with the role, or I would have to take time off sick. And that is quite honestly the reality of the situation whenever it came to employment and not having the accommodations in place that I required. Whenever I started working for AsIAm, working full-time no longer became an issue. In fact, I wanted to work more than full-time because I felt so supported and so accommodated within the role that I quite quickly moved from a training role to becoming the deputy CEO. So it just goes to show as well that by putting reasonable accommodations in place, it can massively help towards a person's career progression and their where they fit and how they fit in with the overall organizational structure. And that sense of belonging as well, feeling that you really have been understood and accommodated, can massively contribute towards your sense of identity within this organization. But like I said, this isn't just for autistic people. If you're accommodating everybody who walks through the door in the way that you would accommodate an autistic person, it's just going to be a more inclusive workplace in general. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the day-to-day things that I think would be considered reasonable accommodations and in-work supports for an autistic or neurodiverse employee. So the first thing that I found to be incredibly helpful, especially when starting in a new role, was very clear step-by-step instructions. So a difference that many autistic people experience is in the ability to socially imagine. Now, social imagination is being able to take pieces of learned information and applying them to what to expect out of this day. So I know that because I worked in a training role before, that this is what my day would involve. But for autistic people, whenever you're focusing on the really small details of everything, no two things seem the same. So it's necessary to have clear step-by-step instructions in this role, in this day, on this project. Even if you've worked in a training officer role your entire life, we can't underestimate the value and the help that clear step-by-step instructions can provide in terms of support. So knowing what the first step is whenever you're putting together a project, knowing what things you need to do, you have a checklist, what you should be prioritizing. It's really helpful to have somebody lay all this out for you in order to navigate not just your first day or your first months, but just going forward, and then supporting a person in being able to create their own step-by-step instructions is a massive way of building capacity within the workplace. Sensory environmental adaptations are really important. So a lot of workplaces these days, well, I suppose in COVID, a lot of people are now working from home, which can be a blessing or a curse, depending on the kind of person you are. Some people find working from home to be a more sensory friendly environment, and some people find it to be the complete opposite, depending on what your home environment is like. But a lot of offices these days have been modernized to be open workspaces, to be very bright, lots of natural light, and the concept of hot desking as well is quite new. So people come in and just sit wherever's available. But to an autistic person, this is actually a bit of a nightmare because it totally gets rid of the predictability element of what to expect from that day. So there are certain things you can do within the work environment, and there are resources that we'll be making available around looking at what the current situation of the sensory environment is. What's the lighting like? the lighting like? What's the noise level like? What is the predictability and structure like? Or is the kitchen too close to the work area that you can smell people making their lunch? I mean, these are things that can massively impact an autistic or neurodiverse person in the ability to carry out their day-to-day functions of their role. It doesn't seem like something that many people would consider, but it genuinely is a reasonable accommodation to be looking at your sensory environment and what a person requires out of the sensory adaptations. A withdrawal space is something that I think everybody would benefit from, but a quieter work area or a quiet room. Now, this is perhaps if somebody really needs time to focus and to think and to not be in the middle of conversations or consultations or pieces of collaboration that are taking place, but they genuinely need to focus on what they're working on right now. They have a quieter space to go to, or they have a space to completely withdraw and switch off, and that enables them to stay in the workplace a bit longer. So, for example, a lot of people like to socialize at break time or at lunchtime. They like to sit and eat lunch together, and that's their way of connecting, of socializing, of getting that interaction throughout the day. But for me personally, I need to be on my own during that time. So I would need to switch off during the 15-minute coffee break or during my lunch. I need to go off and not speak to anybody. And that enables me to participate for the rest of the day, the rest of the working day, to have the conversations that are required with my staff, with my team, with my colleagues. And if I had to socialize during those times, I wouldn't actually be able to work as effectively the rest of the day. So a quiet space or somewhere that you're able to withdraw. You know, a lot of people would say, oh, you can just go for a walk, but where is your office situated? Is it in the city centre? You know, going for a walk might actually be even more sensory overload. So if there's a possibility to provide a quieter withdrawal space that somebody can go to and not speak during their breaks, you know, that can be really helpful as well. Predictability, that kind of comes into effect with the clear step-by-step instructions, knowing exactly what to expect. Do I know where my desk is whenever I come in? Am I going to have the same desk every day? You know, have my documents been moved? You know, things are looking very different at the moment as we're gradually coming out of COVID, but very much still in the social distancing, you know, having to be quite careful within the workplace if you are working in an office, which means that people's belongings are packed up at the end of the day. Perhaps you come in and there's somewhere that you didn't expect them to be. Those kind of things can be very stressful for an autistic person. So is there anything we can do to aid predictability in this sense? Accepting that a person may need to move around or to stim or to fidget. So, you know, being able to walk around as you're working, you know, that's another thing that's kind of a consideration with COVID. Now, I, for example, can't sit at a desk all day. And if I am, you will find me sitting backwards on my chair. You'll find me sitting, you know, with my legs folded underneath me. I'll have to get up and walk around as I'm speaking. And that is because my brain needs to do that in order to process the information that I'm trying to process as I'm working. So we need to accept that some people will need to move. They will need to walk around. They will need to you know, have some sort of self-regulation tool, and that's okay as well. We shouldn't be expecting people to sit still all day at their desk because that's not normal. So I think it's about normalizing movement within the workplace as well, and I think that would benefit a lot of people. The opportunity to complete one task before moving to another. So this isn't about multitasking, it's more about a sense of achievement. And sometimes I allow myself to take on too many tasks to the point where I feel like I'm not doing anything well. It can be really helpful to be able to start a project or start a task and see it all the way through to finish before you start another one. It gives you a sense of achievement, and it stops you from feeling stressed or that you're not actually able to do your job effectively. Now, I'm not saying you should only be able to do one thing at a time, but it's making sure that somebody is managing their workload and being able to see things through to completion. And that's really important as well in terms of career progression and confidence in their own role. Mentoring, now this is just good practice, I believe. I think everybody should have the opportunity to have a mentor within the workplace. This isn't just somebody who's just started. It isn't somebody who's junior within the organization. Even as a manager, as a senior manager, as a director, it's really important to have somebody who you can go to for advice, to discuss things with. It doesn't have to be somebody who actually works within the organization itself. It could be somebody external. I think setting up a mentoring system for all employees is a great way of, staying on track, making sure that you are heard, making sure that you're supported. But specifically for autistic employees who are just coming into a workplace, having somebody perhaps who's even on the same level as them, who they're able to go to if they have questions, they're able to raise concerns with, without it being a case that they feel like they're reporting to them, that can be really helpful. So it's basically a form of buddy system. I don't really like to use the word buddy system because it can sound a little bit condescending, but it can be a form of mentoring where you have somebody who's at the same level role as you that helps to support you into your role, into your new job as an autistic person, but also stays there, and you can help support each other throughout the life cycle of the role. And the last thing is regular check-ins, and this is something that is really important, I believe, at the moment in a world where most of us are working remotely. We can become so engrossed in our own tasks, sitting at our desk, focusing on our own work, without actually getting the opportunity to link in with other people quite regularly in the way that you would do if you're in the office. This is really important in ensuring that a person feels supported. And it doesn't have to be about, have you done this task? Have you completed this project? It could be, how are you getting on? How are you feeling with working at home? Is there anything that you need from me? I think that's really important and is definitely a type of reasonable accommodation or in-work support. While it might not be something that we can see in front of us, it definitely is a huge form of support for an autistic employee. What I want to talk about now, before I hand over to Adrian, is the points that I think we should consider and take away with us today. Like I mentioned, reasonable accommodations, we often think about the physical supports. For autistic or neurodivergent people, reasonable accommodations are less likely to be visible or tangible. And there's often very little to no cost involved. So it's not a case of making sure the office is wheelchair accessible, making sure there's accessible bathrooms, being able to adjust desk heights or seat heights, or, have any audio supportive equipment. Now, it might be a case that those things are required, but whenever an autistic employee is coming into a workplace, the reasonable accommodations that need to be put in place are very often not visible or tangible. And the only way of being able to ascertain what accommodations a person needs is through the consultation process. So we can't assume before a neurodivergent or autistic employee comes on board what supports they're going to need from us based on the fact that they're autistic. So we can't assume, okay, they're going to need to have ear defenders, or they're going to need to have the lights turned down, or they're going to need to have a quiet working space, because every autistic person is so entirely different from the next. We cannot assume what their sensory needs are before we've met them. We need to consult from the very beginning. We need to ask, what do you need from us? What would make you feel more supported in this role? And it shouldn't be a once-off consultation at the beginning, because it might be a case that the person doesn't know till they've been working there a week or a month or a year exactly what accommodations they need at this point. So consultation should really be an ongoing process. It should be throughout the life cycle of the role, and specifically in relation to career progression. So something I came across recently was that there was an employee who was finding it quite difficult to progress within their career, because a lot of the things that they needed to do in order to progress were not actually laid out for them in a black and white way. It's often the things that weren't expected of them that would lead to career progression. So what I mean by that is, whenever you take on a role, you're given a job description. This is what's expected of you. But it isn't unless you actually go above and beyond what's expected of you that you're going to get the opportunity to be promoted or to move to the next pay grade or level. But we can't tell you what that is because it's not expected of you. Now, that's not actually fair. That's not equitable for one employee who might be able to socially imagine what they can do to lead to, a promotion or the next level of their career. And an autistic person who isn't getting it laid out black and white is not going to get the opportunity to progress within their role. So sometimes it's important to structure and tell a person that this is what the immediate expectations are. If you meet all of your immediate expectations, here are some other things that might be useful for you to dip into or to try and progress your skill set within this area, and that could ultimately lead to career progression for you. So we're not trying to trick anybody here. We're not trying to make it difficult for people to progress within their career. That's something that everybody should have the opportunity to do. And I think supporting that in itself is another type of reasonable accommodation. And the last point here is that the things that we do to reasonably accommodate autistic or neurodivergent employees are actually just best practice across the board. So if we're putting these supports in place for an autistic person, if we put these in place for everybody, it's going to lead to a much more efficient workforce who feel really well supported within their roles. Something I get asked sometimes when I'm giving employment talks is, you know, somebody hasn't disclosed to me that they're autistic. So I know Adrian is going to touch a little bit on disclosure, but if they haven't disclosed to me that they're autistic, but I feel that they might be, how do I go about supporting them? How do I put the reasonable accommodations in place, or how do I have that conversation about what they need? And usually my response is, well, it should be done with everybody. Somebody shouldn't need to have a diagnosis or a disability or, you know, a list that says exactly what they need as a result of being autistic in order to be accommodated. This is something that we should be doing with absolutely every employee that comes through our doors. And just as a way of leading into, I suppose, the points that Adrian wants to discuss, while of course it is a nice thing to do within the workplace to be ensuring that everybody is accommodated, you know, it isn't actually just a nice thing to do. It's not charitable. It's actually the person's right, and it's the law. So under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everybody has the right to work, the right to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. And a lot of the protection against unemployment for autistic people and for those with disabilities or who are neurodivergent is about putting those reasonable accommodations in place. And this doesn't even begin to touch on the rights that fall under the Disability Act, the UNCRPD, or the Equal Status Act, but it's just to reinforce that this is everybody's right. And in order for autistic people to have the just and favourable conditions, in order for them to have their protection against unemployment, one of the key aspects of that is the reasonable accommodations piece. So I'm going to finish on that, and I'm going to hand back over to Hannah. And if anybody has any questions, please just put them in the Q&A box and we can come to them at the end. Thanks a million.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Some excellent food for thought there, definitely. So our second speaker today is Adrian Carroll. Adrian has been working with AsIAM since July 2019 as a training officer before becoming training and accessibility officer in January 2021. He supports the development and delivery of online autism training for businesses and organisations, seeking how best to support autistic clients and customers. In addition to this, he also advises companies and organisations on how they can make their practices more inclusive for autistic people. From Killarney, County Kerry, Adrian's main background is in law and policy. He has a BCL in Law plus History and Cultural Studies from the University of Limerick, along with LLM degrees in General Law from UL and in International and Comparative Disability Law and Policy from NUI Galway. He also has professional experience working in legal support in Brosnan & Co Solicitors, a local solicitor's office in Killarney. Adrian also works with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, sitting on their Disability Advisory Committee, comprising over half its members with lived experience of disability, to monitor how the convention will become law in Ireland and how society can be more equal and inclusive for people with disabilities in Ireland. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Adrian Carroll.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you to Fiona for her wonderful presentation. I'm delighted to be able to speak at this masterclass and to be able to speak in such esteemed company today. So just to kind of give a bit of background of who I am, as Hannah mentioned, my name is Adrian Carroll. I am the Training and Accessibility Officer for AsIAM. So just to kind of give a bit of background as well, I would be sort of, so my main background would be, my main kind of, I suppose I would have a very keen interest on looking at autism from, and the access barriers related to autism from a disability rights kind of lens as well. So I think it's really, so I think I would also kind of look at, so it's also, when it comes to sort of work, so also when it comes, so I think it's really, I think it's also kind of really important. So one of the things that I kind of, so one of the things that I do is I also kind of, my main role within the organization is to look at, is to work in terms of developing the online training programs with AsIAM. And I also kind of help to advise and sort of consult organizations and companies just to, who wish to make their practices more inclusive and accessible to the autism community. So what I am going to cover today is just sort of kind of give a brief of, to kind of give a bit more of an, to look at what, to look at reasonable accommodations and in work supports from both kind of a law perspective and from a disability rights perspective. So so the first thing I would kind of cover is just sort of looking at like the competing models within disability, kind of the two different ways of thinking around disability, some of the legal landscape from an Irish and international perspective in terms of employment and disability, and what are kind of, so what are people with disabilities rights are in the workplace. I will then kind of cover just what are reasonable accommodations are, the benefits for employers of kind of providing reasonable accommodations to the autistic community. I would also kind of look at I would also kind of look at tools that your business or organization can use to support the recruitment of autistic people, for instance, like the reasonable accommodation passport. Some of the wider changes that don't really kind of fall a little bit outside the scope of reasonable accommodations, but can support an autistic person at work. An overview of kind of an overview of what sort of government supports are available to support your business to provide reasonable accommodations when it comes to reimbursing, or when it comes to sort of covering for some of the costs of applying kind of accommodations. And the final piece I would kind of cover is in relation to disclosure. So, which is like what are some things that what are some things an autistic person might consider before making the decision? What are some reasons why an autistic person might choose to disclose, or they might prefer to keep it, or they might choose not to disclose? And finally, what can you do to support an autistic person to cause their difference and or disability at the moment that they're ready to do so. So the first thing I'm going to kind of cover today is just sort of like the two competing models or schools of thoughts in relation to disability. So just to kind of, if you see the screen on the left, you might kind of look at the medical model of disability. So the medical model of disability is kind of very much the prevailing sort of school of thought around disability that kind of guides Irish laws and policies today. So it kind of looks at it from the idea, it kind of looks at the idea that autistic, that very much sort of looks at disability as an individual problem. So it's kind of at this, it kind of looks at what the person, that disability is sort of like something that is wrong, or that is something that is sort of broken within the person, and there's something that needs, or that is something that they might need treatments, or they might treatments or supports in order to kind of address or to mitigate some of the barriers to inclusion that they might experience in their day-to-day lives. So it's kind of that kind of presumption as well, that autistic people are looking for a cure or for a treatment for that condition or disability, that they might need around-the-clock support from carers. There's also kind of different kind of, it also kind of feeds into kind of different sort of narratives and sort of stereotypes around autism, that autistic people must need care, they must need to access day services, they might also need to look at, they're also kind of presumed to be housebound, or they might kind of feel like they're confined or sort of restricted by, as a result of their disability, and not through any external sort of barriers that they might interact with. I guess the final thing I would also kind of say that is that a lot of presumptions and sort of stereotypes around disability kind of come from the medical model. So it's the idea that sees autistic people and disabled people as objects of care or charity, and not as sort of right holders, as Fiona had mentioned. So it's the idea that it also kind of comes to the idea that it feels, so again, it it presumes that autistic people need to work in segregated spaces or segregated environments, and that they don't need access to the mainstream workplace, or that they cannot, or that for whatever reason that cannot work. So they cannot work. So so it kind of just kind of gives a bit of snapshot as to what it's very much kind of still to what the medical model is, how it is still the prevailing sort of school around disability, and how that might kind of pose barriers to autistic people who might be looking for support at work, or who might feel that they fall, for whatever reason, that they find themselves falling outside of the traditional kind of notions or kind of preconceptions around autism, and they find it very difficult for themselves. They find it very difficult to access supports as a result. So the next thing I will kind of cover is so in recent years we have been kind of making the transition away from a medical model of disability towards the social model. So instead of kind of looking at disability as an individual problem, it looks at disability and kind of differences like autism from a wider society lens. So this is kind of looking at like what, it kind of looks at so they look at, let's say, so it might be kind of, for instance, attitudes, it might be access to supports, it might be kind of the sensory environment, it might be communication or sensory processing. And these all would have an impact in terms of how an autistic person might feel accepted or included in society. So I think an inaccessible world would make it harder for an autistic person to find a job. They might make it harder for an autistic person to feel accepted or included in society. They might make it harder for an autistic person to be protected from prejudice or ableism or discrimination. Or they might feel that they have let's say, fewer life prospects, or they might feel that they might experience disadvantaged at work when compared to the neurotypical peers. So I think it's a really kind of it's a really important way of looking at disability, because it shifts the problem away from the person towards what we as a society can do to support and to include autistic people as well. So just kind of moving on from there, I'm going to cover the Irish law in relation to employment and disability. So the first piece I want to cover is in relation to the Employment Equality Act, and these prevent disability discrimination on disability grounds, and they set out some of what people people's rights are in the workplace. So they kind of cover things like advertising, equal pay for work of equal value, access to employment, to vocational training, to work experience, in terms of kind of in terms of equity, in terms of terms and conditions, promotion and career development opportunities, and also kind of looking at what your rights are if you're facing dismissal, or if you're facing dismissal or disciplinary issues at work. So it also kind of sets that employers cannot discriminate against people with disabilities with respect to application forms, to job interviews, to aptitude tests, to pay conditions and benefits, to dismissal and to disciplinary issues. So all of these different grounds are areas in which autistic people face barriers within society, and these are all kind of things that employers need to do in order to not discriminate or to include against or to discriminate against people with disabilities. It also kind of sets out that employers need to make reasonable accommodations to different aspects of the work where people with disabilities might need additional supports with. So these are kind of in relation to such things as job applications, to interviews, and to everyday work practices. It also finally sets out that employers can also take positive action or positive measures to address areas of disadvantage that people with disabilities or autistic people might experience, and to tackle unconscious bias within the organization. These are things like designating specific jobs for that that reserved for a marginalized group, for instance, like people with disabilities, hiring or having recruitment quotas where an organization would have to hire, let's say, a certain percentage of a marginalized group, like people with disabilities, or applying sort of specific workplace supports that would benefit the disabled community, or that would support autistic people in the workplace. So just to kind of quickly cover what the international law around employment and disability is, as Fiona mentioned as well, the big kind of article with respect to the UN in CRPD is Article 27, and this kind of covers the right to work for that people with disabilities, and just sets out that people with disabilities have an equal right to work as their non-disabled peers. So they have the right to be protected from discrimination, have equal working conditions, have equal access to training and career development opportunities, to on-the-job supports, and to reasonable accommodations. So those are all kind of areas in which disabled people. Those are all kind of different areas that kind of protect disabled people at work, but but it also kind of applies from within. It also kind of in terms of the way that the UNCRPD talks about disability. The way that it kind of talks about disability, it talks about it through a very social model lens. So in that sense, it makes it more inclusive. It kind of reframes disability to being more inclusive of autistic people, and to be more inclusive of autistic people's access needs, particularly with respect to people who might be experiencing things like sensory processing difference, or people who might be experiencing more than one barrier, multiple areas of discrimination. Like, say, for instance, if they might have, let's say, one or more disabilities that in addition to their autism diagnosis, or they might also belong to another protected or marginalized group as well. So just to also kind of quickly cover the Equal Treatment Framework Directive. This sets out measures on an EU-wide level which protect disabled people against discrimination. So it obliges states to use national laws to protect disabled people, and ensure employers eliminate practice discriminate against people with disabilities. So these include the Equal Status Act and the Employment Equality Act. So what's also important in terms of the Equal Treatment Directive is that it also covers both direct and indirect discrimination. So basically and it also kind of sets out the definition for reasonable accommodation through Article 5, which explains that appropriate measures to enable a person with a disability to have access to, participate in, employ or advance in employment, or to undergo training, measures would impose a disproportionate burden on an employer. So just also to kind of quickly cover what reasonable accommodation means in practice. So the Equal Status Acts of 2000 to 2015 kind of essentially sets out that disability is one of the 11 grounds of discrimination. Section 16 of the Employment Equality Act obliges employers to provide reasonable accommodations to disabled employees. So it also kind of looks at reasonable accommodations as adaptations which help an employee with a disability, including autism, to take up or to continue work in mainstream settings. So these include having equal opportunities to apply for work, to be treated equally as their colleagues, to have equal opportunities for promotion or career development opportunities, to undertake training. And it also kind of sets out that employers may not have to provide accommodations if it proposes a disproportionate burden regarding the costs involved, the resources available, and available public funding. So the employer is also not obliged to put accommodations if it falls outside an employee's typical work duties, or if work tasks are changed to such an extent that it fundamentally changes the job's essential functions. So kind of looking at like some of the the benefits of providing reasonable accommodations. So basically, one of the things that's really important for us is just to kind of mention that reasonable accommodations is good for business. Many employers have noted that reasonable accommodations are highly effective in supporting disabled people and in terms of making their workplaces more attractive to people with disabilities. As Fiona also mentioned as well, most reasonable accommodations, particularly for the autistic community, are not expensive. So many accommodations also, particularly ones that would involve a change to a process or to a procedure, would often come with no costs upfront. And when it comes to things like more expensive supports as well, when it comes to supports that are more expensive, that there are government supports available, which I will quickly cover later. And also in terms of kind of looking at what reasonable accommodations do as well, one of the things that businesses kind of found really helpful is that it helped to retain valuable employees and to attract new talent, to increase overall productivity, to increase workplace health and safety, and to reduce worker absences. It also ensures that autistic people and disabled people are valued and appreciated in the workplace, and that the supports they need will support them to succeed at work. We also kind of say as well that autistic friendly measures are people friendly measures. So as Fiona also mentioned, that these are all kind of like setting out an autism friendly workspace is kind of best practice across the board. And it will encourage more people to be open about their identity, or to be open about having a disability, or about being autistic. So, and I think the final thing we also kind of want to the thing we also want to mention as well, that having reasonable accommodations is not mysterious. It's good practice, and it's good management as well. So it's not really anything that would be that much different to accommodating another employee's needs. For instance, if somebody might be, let's say for instance, if somebody might have to kind of take care of a family member, or they might want to be there for their child, or they might want to be there for their child at school. While there are legal obligations and there are legal liabilities, that it's not really any different to kind of looking to making sure that other employees who don't have disabilities are accommodated and are supported at work. So our main goal is to ensure that there's an accessible, autism-friendly workplace where all employees are accommodated without needing to ask. So examples of reasonable accommodations include providing advance notice of meetings and the topics to be discussed, to allow for different modes of communication, to provide regular stim breaks, to provide sensory toys, noise cancelling headset, and ear defenders, to break down instructions into steps, to offer written instructions, to provide a quiet workspace, to allow for remote working for part or all of the working week, to assign a workplace buddy or mentor, to provide access to a job coach or to supported employment if an employee needs it, to set out clear expectations, or to even allow an employee to have more time to practice new tasks if they need it. The next thing we want to cover as well is a reasonable accommodation passport. I think that these are things that can be quite useful support for both an employer and an employee in terms of kind of setting the parameters about how a conversation around disclosing a disability may go. So they can support an autistic person to disclose and to request supports, but equally it can also support an employer to know to work through the disclosure process and to feel and to also kind of feel that there's kind of a continuity of supports as well, and to ensure that the supports applied are consistent, and they can work with different changes that can happen within the workplace. So they allow an employee to explain any workplace barriers they may experience. It can allow the employee to explain or to suggest any accommodations that would support them at work. It can give the employer and the employee the opportunity to review the extent how accommodations match support needs and to make any adjustments needed. They also provide employees with a consistency and a continuity support. And it also kind of gives a vehicle to manage workplace transitions and to conduct future reviews on the employee supports. I think when it comes to sort of kind of widening the lens a little bit and kind of looking about what other practices that can make your workplace more autism friendly, one of the things some things that I think would be helpful would be to have an organization-wide reasonable accommodation policy that everybody can have access to workplace support, to mainstream autism and disability into your workplace practices and to your workplace policies, to provide a relaxation space in the workplace. I think the disability rights mantra of nothing about us without us is also really important here. Because I think that one of the things where I think it's really important is to ensure that if you're proposing any organization-wide changes, that autistic people are consulted and have the opportunity to provide feedback and to feed into any organization policies and processes, and to ensure that they know what changes are coming ahead so they can prepare and to get plenty of advance notice of any changes. Reducing potentially distracting or overwhelming sensory stimuli in the workplace is really important. For instance, as Fiona mentioned, it can be a matter of just like being able to control natural light, to reduce smells or noises around in the workplace. Providing information around autism from reputable sources like autistic-led organizations such as AsIAM, other autistic self-advocates, and other organizations working in the space, such as Specialistern, such as Employers for Change. There's lots of organizations out there that can support your organization or in the area of disability inclusion and in terms of including autistic people. I think also just to ensure that your organization's instructions are written and communicated concisely and accurately. I think the final thing I'm just going to cover is in the area of disclosure. So I think disclosure can be a real dilemma for many autistic people. Just to kind of take a great deal of confidence. So I guess what are some things to kind of discuss? So what are some things to kind of consider as well is whether disclosing a disability would cause people to treat me differently at work? Would I be judged to exactly the same standards as neurotypical colleagues? What would happen if I were to do things differently? How do I explain autistic traits? Would they judge me if I STEM? Would my workplace be supportive of me if I disclose? How do I deal with managers' and colleagues' attitudes to autism? And what I need to mask if I don't disclose are huge considerations that autistic people might need to think about before making the decision to disclose. So I guess the final thing I want to kind of cover is how organizations can make the disclosure process easier for autistic people. So a key part is to create an inclusive workplace culture, ensure that all staff have access to disability and understanding training, making sure that staff take a positive approach to disability and autism, and to autistic people and to disabled people's strengths, making sure that your organization is fully accessible to the autistic and disability communication, to provide lots of opportunities for an autistic person to disclose when they feel comfortable, to clearly set out what will happen when an autistic person discloses, encourage autistic people to be their autistic selves at work, to ensure that autistic people get access to any supports they need if they do disclose, and finally to be mindful that there's lots of barriers to getting an official diagnosis, particularly in adults. So it shouldn't be it shouldn't necessarily be expected in order to get support. So I am well over time, so I'm just going to leave this and going to pass this over to my colleague Sophia. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that, Adrian. Some really helpful tips, and great to know the background and all the legal pieces of that as well.
Yeah.
No one better than yourself to tell us all about that. So we're now going to hear from Sophia Webb. So Sophia started an internship at AsIAM in June 2019 as part of her employment-based training course at the National Learning Network. She quickly became part of the team, and now she works in the administration department. Her role involves producing AsIAM Autism ID cards and assisting in the organisation of fundraising events. She also helps to coordinate the Youth Leadership Team programme and the Youth Ambassador programme as well. Sophia was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when she was 10 years old. She's delighted that she can now use her experience to encourage other autistic people to be themselves and nurturing autism acceptance and inclusion in the wider community. When she's not working, Sophia enjoys spending time volunteering at her local thrift shop, upcycling old materials, and walking her dog Bonnie on her family's farm in County Wicklow. So I'm so delighted to be able to present to you my other wonderful colleague, Sophia Webb. You might just need to unmute yourself there, Sophia.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm just going to share my screen and get my slides up. Okay, so just 1 second. 1 sec, sorry. Now, so as Hannah said, my name is Sophia, and I'm autistic. I was diagnosed when I was 10 years old, and at that time, my diagnosis was Asperger's, but I prefer to just say autism. I went to a mainstream school, did my Leaving Cert in 2013, and then following that, I went to DIT, which is now TU Dublin, through the DARE scheme. So I would have got reasonable accommodations in college for my exams. I would have got extra time and a smaller setting to do my exams in, which I found very stressful, and I'm glad they're behind me now. So yeah, while in college, I studied public health nutrition, and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in public health nutrition in 2017. So as Hannah said, I started an employment-based training program in the National Learning Network in April 2019, after a couple of years of struggling to find work by myself, sending off my CV to different organizations and workplaces and not hearing anything back, or maybe having a couple of, the odd interview, but not being successful in them. So I was encouraged by my instructors in the NLN to do my work experience in AsIAM. And so I began that in June 2019. So at this point, most of my friends didn't know I was autistic. I was masking all the time, hiding my traits. I was scared to show that I was autistic because of the stigma, like Adrian said. I'm just afraid of the attitudes and of those around me, and how people might perceive me if I was to disclose my diagnosis. So I became an admin assistant officially in February 2020. And my main role is to manage the Autism ID cards. So there's a picture there of the front of the card on the screen. So these work as sort of self-advocacy tools. So the autistic person can show the card to, if they're in a workplace, or if they're in a public place, or in public transport, or in a shop, for example, maybe the queue nowadays, queuing during COVID, you have to queue up, or the guarded checkpoints are very handy for people to just show that, okay, I'm autistic. And on the back, there's a bit of information too, just to ask, to explain that the person might need extra supports, like maybe you to be patient or calm, and just to be clear, use clear language with them as well. So it really gives me a sense of purpose, and I love the fact that I can now actually advocate for and support people like me, so that, you know, other people don't feel the same stigma, aren't afraid to be autistic, be themselves. So yeah, I also work with the merchandising. So if any orders come into the shop on a website, I dispatch them. And as Hannah said, I work with the fundraising and the leadership teams as well. So that's the extent at the moment. So the supports I get at work include, I work a 4-day week, which is nice. I usually take a Wednesday off, so it's just nice to have that day off in the middle of the week to kind of rest and recuperate, and maybe just, you know, just catch up on other personal things or sleep and stuff. So it's just nice. And then we also have a casual dress code in the office, so we can just wear whatever we're comfortable in. I don't like certain clothing, maybe the textures of things. I don't like them really too tight fitting. I can walk around my socks if I need to. Or currently I have no socks on. I've got sandals on today, but I took them off to give this talk. I can use my noise cancelling headphones and fidget toys. I'm also given like manageable targets and deadlines, and I can work at my own pace to achieve these goals. So it's really, I just love working in such an inclusive environment. And like we heard from Adrian, Fiona, like it's just a privilege that I get to work here, and that like before working here, I never dreamt that I'd be able to be open about my autism. And here I am speaking publicly about it. So this just shows you, like Fiona said, what can be done when the accommodations are in place and when your employees feel comfortable in themselves. So the process of getting supports for me in AsIAM was very straightforward. There was already an inclusive culture here, so I felt comfortable as soon as I started my placement. I can stim freely, I can, go for a walk if I need to, I can just do whatever I feel comfortable doing to function really, and to manage my sensory needs and my all our needs. So I have clear communication and open communication with my manager. So that means I can tell him my accommodation needs, whether I need to take a break, whether I need some quiet time just to focus on a task and not be disturbed. And we also have regular staff surveys where we can give our opinions and make suggestions. So the most recent survey was around returning to work. And the questions included like how many days we'd like to be in the office, whether we'd like to be sit at the same desk every day, or if we could hot desk, for example. And it's just lovely to know that these supports are there when I need them, and that I can just be myself and stim freely, as I say, and just work comfortably. So this is my last slide. So my advice for employers, anyone watching this, is to be flexible. Listen to your employees, their needs, to any concerns they might have, and then allow them to work hours that suit them as much as possible. It's not always possible. Sometimes, you might have a certain deadline coming up, and you need to work. You need to work hard to get this done. Maybe work a weekend, but just to where possible, to allow them maybe that prefer to be work in the morning or in the evening, and also be conscious of sensory differences. And keep background noise and other sensory stimuli to a minimum. Like, it's not always possible to do this. Like, for example, our office is right beside the DART station. So there's trains coming and going all the time, and I find them quite noisy and they can disturb me. And so I wear my headphones, and that just reduces that a bit. So it's not always possible to eliminate all sensory input, but just to be mindful of that, and then to allow the use of sensory aids. to kind of mitigate for that. And also to keep communication open. Remember, like we've heard, that everyone has a different communication style. Some people need written information, be that in an email or a checklist or a list of instructions, in order to do that task. They're well able to do the task, they just need it maybe broken down a little bit, or which I think is useful for everyone, like we've heard. So, like Adrian mentioned, it's very important to note that some staff may not know they're autistic, or they might not feel comfortable disclosing their autism. So it's important that these accommodations are accessible and available to all. So thank you for listening. And again, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer you. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Sophia, for sharing your experience there. And I totally agree with you about the survey that we all got, the staff of AsIAM got, to give our opinions on coming back to work. I'm not autistic, and I found that survey really helpful. So it's that kind of thing where that it's offered to everybody, and nobody needs to ask for those supports because they're already in place, which is brilliant. So we do have we have 2 questions in the question box, but they're from the same person, so I'm going to put them together as one question. So how can we really ensure that any person who may have a disability is comfortable in coming forward? Have you seen any good examples of where people felt really comfortable in coming forward in discussing their disabilities? And I might put that one to Fiona, given all your management experience. I feel you might have seen that before, or be the have some experience to answer that question with.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Those are actually really good questions, and they kind of work together really well. I suppose the first one, how can we ensure any person who may have a disability feels comfortable coming forward? And I think that's really about looking at your culture, your whole of culture within the organization. We recently, I think it was our last masterclass, possibly the one before, they all kind of are merging into each other at this point, but there was one about an inclusive work culture, how you can look at the overall culture of the workplace, looking at your inclusion policies, your diversity policies. It's about making sure that person feels comfortable, not just those with a disability, but everybody who comes through your doors. That consultation piece, like I said towards the end of my slides there, if we are putting supports and accommodations in place that any employee requires during that consultation process at the beginning, those who do have a disability, those who are neurodivergent or autistic, they're going to feel more comfortable disclosing if they see that they are in an environment that wants to support everybody, regardless of, disability or diagnosis. I think the more you can do within your organization to show that you are an inclusive workplace. For example, all the organizations who've signed up to our communities of practice in partnership with Irish Jobs, there's about 20 of them, and for all of the employees who are working there in each of those organizations, I imagine if they're autistic, there's a certain sense of pride and belonging and positive sense of identity that my workplace is doing more to understand people like me, is doing more to understand people who think differently. And I think if you're looking at it from a whole of culture approach, rather than looking very specifically at, the interview process or reasonable accommodations or, onboarding, you need to, all those things can't exist within a vacuum. You need to look at how it flows the whole way across. And I think that's the only way really that somebody who may have a disability or somebody who may be neurodivergent is going to feel entirely comfortable in being the best version of their autistic selves. Have I seen any good examples of where a person felt really comfortable in coming forward? Well, we just heard from Sophia. I think that's a perfect example. Now, obviously, it's a little bit unique in that we're the National Autism Charity. So if you can't feel comfortable coming and working here being autistic, there's definitely an issue. But I think that's kind of that's the attitude that that's the feeling that any autistic person should have going into any workplace, that they should feel comfortable in coming forward and discussing or disclosing their diagnosis or their disability. But we can't get to that point unless we look at the whole of culture approach. Like, we have so many different projects within AsIAM that run all the way across the life cycle, from early years all the way up to third level in employment like this one. And something that we've noticed consistently across the board is that whenever people are being more open and transparent about the efforts and the knowledge that they're trying to gain in order to be more inclusive, more accessible, more understanding of autistic people, of neurodivergent people, of all different forms of diversity, the higher the rate of disclosure is. So they come hand in hand. Whenever you start that process and you say, okay, I'm going to be an autism friendly employer, I'm going to be very positive about LGBTQ rights and every form of diversity that you can engage in, the more you adopt that into your culture, the more you're going to have somebody come forward and say, do you know what, I am autistic, or do you know what, I am trans, or I am gay, those kind of things. You're going to see a higher rate of disclosure in all forms of diversity, and the more effort you put into actually accommodating them to begin with. So we shouldn't be waiting for somebody to come forward and making a disclosure before we start to make the effort of being more inclusive. The inclusion piece should happen first, and then we're naturally going to see more disclosure happen afterwards.
That's great. I think that is the only question that's in the Q&A box. So hopefully if anyone had any other questions, they were answered throughout the course of the session. I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers, to Fiona Ferris, to Adrian Carroll, and to Sophia Webb for coming along today and sharing all of their experience and their advice on this topic. And thank you to everyone who came along to participate and to engage in this webinar as well. And we look forward to working with you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.